Henry Tudor entered the world on June 28, 1491, not in a drafty castle or a fortified keep, but in the magnificent royal palace of Greenwich. Imagine a palace nestled right on the banks of the River Thames, its grand windows looking out over the water's gentle, patient flow. The river was a constant presence in his life, slow, endless, a silent witness to the story that was just beginning to unfold. This wasn't just any royal residence. Greenwich Palace was a place of comfort and beauty, its halls adorned with soft tapestries and its floors polished to a mirror-like shine. Outside, quiet gardens bloomed, where birds would greet the dawn with delicate songs, a peaceful soundtrack to a royal childhood. But here's the thing you need to remember about this young prince. Henry was not born to be king. The crown wasn't his destiny, not at first. He was the second son, the spare heir. This meant he had a freedom his older brother, Arthur, could only dream of. While Arthur was being meticulously groomed for the throne, burdened by the weight of future kingship, young Henry was allowed to simply be a boy. He could wander the palace grounds, explore the hidden corners of the gardens, and learn at his own pace, driven by curiosity rather than duty. This freedom shaped him in profound ways. He threw himself into his studies with a passion that was remarkable. He wasn't just learning to read and write. He was devouring knowledge. He fell in love with poetry, composing his own verses. He became a gifted musician, mastering multiple instruments and even composing music that is still played today. He had a natural talent for languages, becoming fluent in Latin and French, and even picking up a respectable amount of Italian. He was a true Renaissance man in the making, long before he ever imagined he would wear the crown. But his education wasn't confined to the schoolroom. He was also trained in all the courtly arts. He learned how to move with grace and confidence in the intricate dances of the court, a skill that was as much about politics as it was about entertainment. He was taught the art of combat, not just how to fight, but how to do so with elegance and style, becoming a formidable jouster and swordsman. He learned how to command a room with his voice, to speak with an authority that belied his position as the second son. In every way, he was being polished into a dazzling jewel of the Tudor court. Think of him as a young lion, full of energy and charisma. He was tall for his age, with that famous red gold hair and a magnetic personality that drew people to him. He excelled at everything he tried, whether it was on the tilting yard, in a debate with scholars, or on the dance floor. He was handsome, athletic, and intelligent, a combination that made him the star of his father's court. While his brother Arthur was the quiet, serious heir, Henry was the vibrant, captivating prince who seemed to embody all the promise of this new Tudor dynasty. He wasn't raised to rule, no, but in every other respect, he was raised to shine. Every lesson, every skill, every accomplishment was another layer of polish on this already brilliant young man. His father, Henry VII, a shrewd and cautious king, must have looked at his second son with a mixture of pride and perhaps a little unease. Here was a prince with all the qualities of a great king, but without the direct path to the throne. The stage was set, the players were in place, but the script of Henry's life was about to take a dramatic and unexpected turn. The spare was about to become the heir, and the boy who was raised to shine was about to be forged into a king who would change England forever. The river flowed on, and destiny was waiting just around the bend. In the grand tapestry of English history, some threads are woven with gold and glory, while others are stitched with shadow and sorrow. Our story today begins with one such thread, a moment of profound quiet that would echo through centuries, changing the destiny of a nation and a young boy who never expected to be king. Imagine the turn of the 16th century. England is under the firm hand of the first Tudor monarch, Henry VII. He has brought peace after decades of brutal civil war. And now, all hopes for a stable, prosperous future rest on the shoulders of his eldest son, Arthur, Prince of Wales. Arthur was everything a future king was meant to be. He was the perfect heir, meticulously groomed for the throne since birth. Unlike his boisterous younger brother, Arthur was thoughtful, reserved, and deeply serious. Chroniclers of the time describe him as scholarly and disciplined, a young man who understood the immense weight of the crown he was destined to wear. He was named after the legendary King Arthur, a clear signal from his father that this new Tudor dynasty was a revival of Britain's mythic, glorious past. The whole kingdom looked to Arthur. He was the sun around which the court revolved. His education was second to none, filled with classical literature, theology, and the arts of statecraft. He was the embodiment of Renaissance princely virtue. In 1501, a monumental alliance was sealed with his marriage to the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a political masterstroke, uniting two of Europe's rising powers. The celebrations were magnificent, a dazzling display of Tudor wealth and ambition. The future seemed secure, the line of succession clear and strong. Arthur and Catherine were sent to Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border to begin their life together and learn how to rule. The kingdom held its breath, awaiting the birth of another heir, the next link in the golden chain. But history, as we know, is rarely so predictable. It moves in whispers, not just shouts. And in the spring of 1502, a shadow fell over the house of Tudor, a shadow that would alter everything. At Ludlow, both Arthur and Catherine fell gravely ill with a mysterious sickness, likely the sweating sickness, a terrifying and swift epidemic of the age. For weeks, they battled the fever. Catherine, resilient and strong, slowly recovered. But Arthur, the hope of England, was not so fortunate. On April 2nd, 1502, at just 15 years old, Arthur, Prince of Wales, died. The news did not arrive in London like a thunderclap. There were no dramatic pronouncements from a castle balcony, no immediate public chaos. Instead, it traveled like a slow, cold wind, seeping through the stone corridors of the royal palaces. Imagine the scene. The news is delivered to the king and queen in the dead of night. A confessor gently wakes Henry VII to tell him his son, his heir, is gone. The king, known for his stoicism and iron control, reportedly broke down, weeping uncontrollably. It was the Queen, Elizabeth of York, who had to comfort him, reminding him they still had a fair prince and two fair princesses, but her strength was a facade. After consoling her husband, she returned to her own chambers and was overcome with a grief so profound it was said to have shaken her to her core. The loss was not just personal, it was dynastic, it was a crisis. The future they had so carefully constructed had just crumbled into dust. Across the palace, the atmosphere was one of muted, stunned silence. Servants moved with quiet feet, their faces drawn and somber. The usual hustle and bustle of court life ceased, replaced by the hushed whispers of grieving courtiers. Outside, the only sound that broke the stillness was the distant, mournful tolling of church bells from across the river, each chime a hammer blow, marking the end of an era. And in the middle of this silent storm of grief and uncertainty stood a 10-year-old boy, Prince Henry. Up until this point, Henry's life had been relatively carefree. He was the spare, not the heir. He wasn't burdened with the same intense training for kingship as his brother. He was robust, athletic, and charming, known for his love of music, dancing, and sport. While Arthur was studying state papers, Henry was more likely to be found hunting, jousting, or composing music. He was being groomed for a high position, perhaps a great churchman like a cardinal, but not for the throne itself. His path was secondary, his future less defined, less heavy. But in the moment he learned of his brother's death, all of that changed. In an instant, his childhood was over. The freedom he had known vanished. That heavy cloak of responsibility, the one Arthur had worn his entire life, was suddenly, unexpectedly, settled upon his own young shoulders. He was no longer just Prince Henry. He was now the Duke of Cornwall, the Earl of Chester, and soon the new Prince of Wales. He was the future. He was the heir to the throne of England. Think about that transition. For a 10-year-old boy, it must have been bewildering. One day, you are the second son, living in the shadow of a perfect older brother. The next, you are the single hope of a kingdom, the focus of every courtier's ambition, every diplomat's calculation, and every parent's desperate prayer for the dynasty's survival. The grief for his lost brother would have been mingled with a terrifying new reality. The games would stop. The lessons would change. The weight of an entire nation was now his to bear. This single death set in motion a chain of events that would define the 16th century. Without Arthur's death, Henry would likely never have become king. He would never have married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, a marriage that would later be the catalyst for the English Reformation. The very course of English, and indeed world, history was diverted on that quiet, sorrowful day in 1502. The death of Arthur was a profound personal tragedy for the Tudor family, but it was also the crucible in which the future King Henry VIII was forged. The boisterous, athletic boy began a new, more intense education. He had to learn the craft of kingship, and he had to learn it fast. The quiet, somber atmosphere that followed his brother's death was the backdrop against which Henry's new life began. It was a beginning not marked by celebration or fanfare, but by the heavy silence of loss and the dawning of an immense and ultimately world-changing responsibility. And the young boy who stepped out of the shadows would grow into one of the most famous and infamous monarchs in all of history. Have you ever wondered what it takes to turn a child into a king? Not just a prince with a title, but a ruler ready to command a nation. This is the story of young Henry, a boy whose childhood was not filled with carefree games, but with the relentless preparation for a crown he never expected to wear. Imagine this: you're just a kid, the second son, living in the shadow of your older brother. Your path seems clear, perhaps a life in the church or as a powerful duke. But then tragedy strikes. Your brother, the heir, is gone. Suddenly, all eyes are on you. The weight of an entire kingdom settles onto your young shoulders. This is the world that Prince Henry was thrust into. His life changed overnight. The games stopped and the lessons began. The finest tutors from across Europe were summoned to the palace. His days became a structured, predictable rhythm of discipline. The leisurely pace of a second son's education was replaced by an intense, demanding schedule fit for a future king. Every moment was accounted for, every hour dedicated to molding him into the monarch England needed. His world, once expansive with boyish freedom, was now confined to the study, the chapel, and the council chamber. The day started early. Before the sun had fully risen over London, Henry was awake, poring over ancient texts. Morning readings were not stories of knights and dragons, but of Roman emperors and Greek philosophers. He devoured the works of Plato, Aristotle, and Seneca, learning about justice, leadership, and the nature of power. His tutors were relentless, pushing him to understand not just the words, but the complex ideas behind them. These were not simple lessons. They were a deep dive into the minds that had shaped Western civilization. Then came the Latin recitations. In an age where Latin was the language of diplomacy, law, and the church, fluency was non-negotiable. He spent hours chanting conjugations and memorizing long passages from Virgil and Cicero. It was tedious, grueling work, but it sharpened his mind and memory. More than just a language, it was a key that unlocked a world of knowledge and gave him the tool to communicate with the most powerful figures across the continent. He wasn't just learning to speak, he was learning to command respect on an international stage. Afternoons were for debates. His tutors would present him with complex philosophical and political dilemmas. Should a king rule by fear or by love? Is it better to be just or to be merciful? Henry had to argue both sides, to dissect every angle, to think critically and strategically. These were not abstract exercises. They were simulations for the real-life decisions he would one day have to make, decisions that would affect the lives of millions. He learned to construct a logical argument, to anticipate his opponent's moves, and to persuade with the power of reason. Theology was another cornerstone of his education. In a deeply religious era, a king was seen as God's chosen representative on earth. Henry had to understand the intricacies of Christian doctrine, to debate the finer points of Scripture, and to present himself as a devout and pious leader. His faith was not just personal, it was a political tool, a way to secure the loyalty of his people and the legitimacy of his rule. He studied the lives of saints and the history of the Church, learning how to wield spiritual authority as effectively as any sword. But it wasn't all books and debates. Henry was also trained in the courtly arts. He learned to dance, to compose music, to appreciate fine art. These were the skills of a Renaissance prince, designed to show that he was not just a warrior or a scholar, but a man of culture and refinement. He learned the subtle language of courtly life, how a single glance, a carefully chosen word, or a slight gesture could convey more than a lengthy speech. The court was a stage, and he was learning to be its lead actor. Even with this all-encompassing education, he was still a boy. In the quiet hours of the night, after the tutors had gone and the palace had settled into a hushed silence, the weight of his destiny would press down on him. He would stand by the tall palace windows, looking out at the dark, flowing waters of the Thames. He'd watch the flickering lantern lights on the boats drifting by, each one a small, simple life, so different from the one laid out for him. In these solitary moments, his young mind wrestled with the enormous responsibility he was about to inherit. He wasn't just Henry anymore. He was the future of England. Most importantly, he learned to project an aura of unshakable calm, to appear decisive and in control, even when his mind was a storm of uncertainty and the world was clamoring for answers. Those skills were important, yes, but they were secondary. The real battle was won in the classroom, in the library, and in the quiet moments of reflection. The discipline, the patience, the strategic thinking, and the mask of composure. These were the skills that would define his reign. They would allow him to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, to outmaneuver his rivals, and to hold a kingdom together through times of turmoil. The boy, looking out at the Thames, was becoming a master of a different kind of warfare, the kind fought not with steel, but with intellect and will. His tutors weren't just teaching him facts, they were forging a king. In the year 1509, a young man of just 17 years old stepped onto the world stage, not just as a prince, but as a king. His name was Henry, and he was about to become King Henry VIII of England. The weight of a nation now rested on his broad, youthful shoulders. Picture this scene, if you will, a vast, echoing cathedral, maybe Westminster Abbey. Sunlight, like liquid gold, pours through towering stained glass windows, painting the stone floors in a kaleidoscope of jewel-toned colors. The air is thick with the scent of incense, its fragrant smoke rising in soft, lazy spirals toward the vaulted ceilings. Above, choirs are singing, their voices weaving long, gentle notes that seem to hang in the air, echoing through the ancient stone arches in a sound so pure it could break your heart. And through this sacred space, a young man walks. He moves slowly, deliberately, down the long central aisle. His coronation robes are heavy, intricate, shimmering like burnished gold and deep crimson velvet under the light. They are the very fabric of power. Every single eye in that packed cathedral is fixed on him. The air is so still, you can feel the collective held breath of the nobility, the clergy, the people of England. They are all waiting for him, and yet, despite the hundreds of eyes, despite the immense pressure of the moment, he walks with an unshakable calm. His steps are steady, his gaze forward. He looks like someone not just accepting a role, but stepping into a destiny he has always known was his. This isn't just a ceremony, it's an affirmation of who he was born to be. This wasn't just any king. This was a new kind of king for a new era. The young Henry had a vision, a grand and ambitious dream for his kingdom. He didn't just want England to be strong, he wanted it to be magnificent. He envisioned a nation that was not only powerful on the battlefield, but also a beacon of art, culture, and learning. He wanted to be a true Renaissance king, a patron of the arts, a scholar, a musician, a leader of intellect and honor. He saw himself as the heart of a cultural rebirth, a new Arthur for a new Camelot. In these early years of his reign, Henry was everything a kingdom could hope for. He was admired, he was respected, and by many, he was absolutely adored. People saw in him the promise of a golden age. He was handsome, athletic, and intelligent. When he spoke, his voice was strong and clear, resonating with an authority that belied his age. His posture was regal, his presence commanding. Whether he was on the jousting field, in the council chamber, or at a courtly dance, he dominated the space. He was, in every sense, a king built for greatness. But history teaches us a valuable lesson. Greatness often brings with it the burden of choice. The path to glory is paved with decisions, some small, some monumental. And for a king like Henry, these choices would not only define his reign, but would ripple through the centuries, changing the course of his nation, his faith, and his own life in ways no one, not even the confident young man walking down that cathedral aisle, could have ever imagined. The story of Henry VIII is a story of how choices, one after another, can transform a hero into something else entirely. And it was just beginning. Welcome back to our journey through the life of Henry VIII. In our last chapter, we saw a young, vibrant prince ascend to the throne. Today, we turn to the woman who stood beside him, the queen who defined the first half of his reign, Catherine of Aragon. This is not just a story of a queen, but a tale of loyalty, love, and a destiny that would forever alter the course of England. When Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon in 1509, it was more than just a political alliance. It was the union of two powerful personalities. Catherine was the daughter of the legendary Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, who had united Spain and sponsored Columbus's voyages. She was raised in a court renowned for its piety, intellect, and political savvy. She was, in every sense, bred to be a queen. Henry, young and energetic, saw in Catherine a partner of immense stature. She was 5 years his senior, a widow of his older brother Arthur, but her wisdom and grace were undeniable. Their marriage began with a genuine warmth that radiated throughout the court. They shared a deep respect for one another, and in the early years, their companionship was a source of strength for the new Tudor dynasty. Imagine them together in those first years. You might see them walking hand in hand through the quiet gardens of Richmond Palace, the scent of roses filling the air as they discussed matters of state. Henry, with his fiery ambition, would find a calming influence in Catherine's gentle patience. She wasn't just his wife. She was his most trusted advisor. Her political instincts were sharp, honed by a childhood spent at the center of European power. Henry valued her counsel immensely, often deferring to her judgment on complex diplomatic issues. Their evenings were often spent in quiet intimacy. By the warm glow of candlelight, they would read scriptures together, sharing a profound and sincere faith that was the bedrock of their lives. But their life wasn't all serious contemplation. The Tudor court was a place of vibrant culture, and Henry and Catherine were at its heart. They would sit side by side, laughing at the boisterous comedies and elaborate masks performed by court players. Henry, a gifted musician himself, would often take to the lute, and Catherine would watch with a proud, appreciative smile. He composed songs for her, and his music filled the halls of their palaces, a testament to the harmony of their early years together. Catherine was more than just a queen consort. She was a regent. When Henry went to war in France in 1513, he didn't leave a council in charge. He left Catherine. He named her regent and governor of England, a display of incredible trust, and she proved worthy of it. While Henry was away, Scotland saw an opportunity and invaded from the north. Catherine rose to the occasion with formidable strength. She organized the English defenses, addressed the troops herself, and oversaw a stunning victory at the Battle of Flodden. She even sent Henry the blood-soaked coat of the fallen Scottish king, James IV, as a trophy of her success. She was not just a queen, she was a warrior queen, every bit as capable as her famous mother. For 2 decades, their partnership brought stability and elegance to England. The court flourished, attracting scholars, artists, and musicians from all over Europe. This was a golden age of culture, presided over by a king and queen who seemed to be a perfect match. Catherine's quiet dignity tempered Henry's flamboyant nature. His restless energy was steadied by her calm resolve. They were a team, united by a shared vision to build a strong and secure Tudor dynasty that would last for generations. But beneath the surface of this idyllic picture, a single, persistent shadow began to grow. It started as a whisper, a private sorrow, but soon it would become a roar that echoed across the kingdom. The issue was succession. In the Tudor world, a king's primary duty was to provide a male heir to secure the throne and prevent the chaos of civil war, a memory still fresh in the English consciousness. Catherine endured numerous pregnancies, each one carrying the hopes of a nation. Time and again, those hopes were met with heartbreak. She gave birth to sons, but they were either stillborn or died within weeks. The cradle in the royal nursery remained tragically empty. Each loss was a private grief for Catherine, a devastating blow for a mother. For Henry, it was a personal tragedy, but also a growing political crisis. In 1516, a flicker of hope arrived. Catherine gave birth to a healthy baby, a child who would survive infancy. But the child was a girl, Princess Mary, while she was cherished, and the court celebrated her birth. She was not the son Henry so desperately needed. In an era that had never seen a queen rule in her own right, a female heir was seen as a precarious solution. The question hung in the air. Could a woman hold the throne? Could she command the loyalty of powerful, ambitious nobles? As the years passed, the worry grew heavier. Catherine was aging, and the chances of her bearing another child, let alone a healthy son, were dwindling. Henry, still in his prime, became increasingly anxious. His desire for a son was not just a matter of personal pride. He genuinely believed it was his sacred duty to God and to his people. The stability he and Catherine had worked so hard to build now seemed fragile, dependent on a single aging heartbeat. Slowly, quietly, a devastating thought began to take root in Henry's mind. He started to look for a reason for this misfortune, a sign, a devout man. He turned to the Bible, searching for an answer, and he found one, or so he believed, in the book of Leviticus. The scripture said that if a man marries his brother's wife, they will be childless. Catherine had been his brother's wife. Their marriage had required a special dispensation from the Pope, precisely because of this biblical prohibition. At the time, it was argued that her first marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, making the rule inapplicable. But now, with a string of dead sons and only a daughter to show for his marriage, Henry began to question it all. Was this his fault? No, he was the king, God's chosen ruler. Could it be Catherine's? Or was their marriage itself the problem? He began to believe that his lack of a male heir was not a matter of chance, but a sign of God's displeasure. He convinced himself that their union was cursed, that he was living in sin, and that God was punishing him by denying him a son. This conviction, born from a mix of genuine religious anxiety, dynastic desperation, and a growing infatuation with a younger woman at court, would set Henry on a collision course with his loyal wife and the entire Catholic world. The warmth of their early years began to cool. The long, thoughtful conversations were replaced by a tense, unspoken distance. Catherine, a woman of unshakable faith and principle, was bewildered. For 20 years, she had been a devoted wife, a trusted advisor, and a capable queen. She had given Henry her unwavering loyalty, her political acumen, and her heart. She had given him a daughter, but she could not give him a son, and so Henry began to look elsewhere. The king's great matter, his quest for an annulment, was about to begin. The patient, wise, and fiercely loyal queen who had helped him build his kingdom would soon become the greatest obstacle to his desires. The love story that had begun with such promise was about to transform into one of history's most famous and tragic divorces. Catherine of Aragon, the Queen of Loyalty, would be forced to fight for her marriage, her title, and her daughter's legitimacy, armed with little more than her faith and her unyielding conviction that she was Henry's one true wife and queen. Her struggle would change England forever. This is the story of the first crack in the crown. For King Henry, it didn't begin with a thunderclap. It started as a whisper, a fleeting thought in the dead of night, a question posed in a passing conversation, a moment of solitude during a lonely walk through the royal gardens. These were small seeds of doubt, easily dismissed at first. But as we know, thoughts have a way of growing, questions tend to multiply, and soon what began as a minor unease blossomed into a profound conflict. Henry found himself torn, caught in a wrenching battle between his deep-seated loyalty to the church and the immense, crushing weight of his kingdom's future. The need for a male heir was more than a personal desire. It was, in his eyes, a divine duty and a political necessity. Without a son, the Tudor dynasty, so recently established by his father after decades of brutal civil war, could crumble. The Wars of the Roses were not so distant memories, and the specter of renewed conflict loomed large. He sought solace and answers in prayer, spending hours on his knees, pleading for divine guidance. He convened his most trusted advisors, engaging in marathon discussions that stretched late into the night, debating theology, law, and politics. The flicker of candlelight in his private chambers would have illuminated a king wrestling not with foreign armies, but with his own conscience. He pored over ancient scriptures, the pages of the Bible becoming a battleground for his soul. He was searching for a sign, a loophole, a justification for the path he felt increasingly compelled to take. Was his marriage to Catherine of Aragon truly blessed by God? Or was his lack of a male heir a divine punishment, as the book of Leviticus seemed to suggest? This inner turmoil wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no public outbursts, no shouting matches in the throne room. It was a slow, creeping tension, like ivy winding its way up an old stone wall, its tendrils silently and relentlessly finding purchase, weakening the very foundation. Every day, the ivy grew thicker, the pressure more intense. Each failed pregnancy, each month that passed without news of a son, was another tendril tightening its grip around his heart and his crown. This gradual, agonizing process was reshaping the man. The confident, athletic, and pious young king was slowly being replaced by a man obsessed, haunted by dynastic insecurity and spiritual doubt. Little did anyone know this quiet internal conflict, this first almost imperceptible crack in the crown, was destined to send shockwaves that would not only shatter Henry's life and marriage, but would also tear his country from its ancient religious foundations and reshape the course of an entire nation. The story of the English Reformation does unstart with an act of parliament or a nail on a church door. It starts here, in the troubled mind of a king, desperate for a son and an answer. Now, if you're imagining a dramatic, stormy entrance, you'd be mistaken. Anne Boleyn didn't burst onto the scene. She arrived quietly, gracefully, almost unnoticed. She had spent her formative years in the sophisticated French court, and she brought that world back with her. She possessed an elegance, a sharp intelligence, and a captivating way of speaking that drew people in without any apparent effort. Picture the great hall of the Tudor court. Musicians are playing soft melodies, and the air is filled with the low murmur of polite conversation among the courtiers. This is where King Henry VIII first laid eyes on her. But Anne moved differently from the other ladies. She wasn't posturing or desperately trying to catch the king's eye. She moved with an innate confidence, a self-awareness that spoke of someone who already understood her own value. This wasn't lost on Henry. What began as simple curiosity quickly turned into admiration, and then, slowly but surely, it blossomed into a profound fascination. He was intrigued by this woman who was unlike anyone he had ever met. The ladies of the English court were often raised to be demure, to agree, to please. Anne, on the other hand, was different. She had a spark, a fire in her eyes. She wasn't afraid to voice her opinions, to engage in witty banter, or even to challenge the king himself in intellectual debates. This was completely new territory for Henry. He was used to women who would acquiesce to his every whim, who would see his attention as the ultimate prize. Anne, however, refused to be just another lady-in-waiting, another fleeting affair for the king. She made it clear from the very beginning that she would not be his mistress. This refusal, this declaration of her own worth, only served to deepen Henry's obsession. It was a challenge, and Henry was a man who loved a challenge. He found himself utterly captivated. Their relationship didn't ignite in a blaze of public passion. Instead, it grew in the quiet, hidden spaces of the court. It was a courtship conducted through long, eloquent letters filled with promises and poetry. It was built on secret glances exchanged across a crowded room and hushed conversations held in candlelit corners, away from the prying eyes of the court. These moments were gentle, slow, and delicate, a stark contrast to the political firestorm they would eventually unleash. The more time Henry spent with Anne, the more he was convinced that she was the only woman for him. He saw in her not just a potential lover, but an intellectual equal, a partner who could stand by his side as a true queen. Her Protestant sympathies also aligned with his growing frustration with the power of the Pope in Rome. Anne wasn't just influencing his heart, she was influencing his mind and his politics. But there was an insurmountable obstacle standing in their way. His wife of over 2 decades, Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine had been a devoted and loyal queen, but she had failed to give Henry what he so desperately craved, a male heir. For years, this had been a source of deep anxiety for the king, a threat to the stability of the Tudor line he had fought so hard to secure. With a now firmly in his heart, Henry's desire for a son became intertwined with his desire for her. He became convinced that his marriage to Catherine, who was his deceased brother's widow, was cursed in the eyes of God. He believed this was the reason he had no male heir. And so, to make Anne Boleyn his queen, Henry needed something that was considered nearly impossible at the time. He needed the Pope to grant him an annulment, to declare his long-standing marriage to Catherine of Aragon null and void. This was not a simple request. Catherine was a Spanish princess, the aunt of the most powerful man in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The Pope was, for all intents and purposes, a prisoner of the emperor. Granting an annulment would be a direct insult to both Catherine and her powerful nephew. The political stakes were astronomically high. Henry, however, was not a man to be deterred. His gentle, private courtship of Anne Boleyn was about to transform into a public political battle that would shake the foundations of England and Europe. He assembled theologians and lawyers to argue his case, which became known as the King's Great Matter. He sent envoys to Rome, pleading and threatening in equal measure. He poured immense resources into trying to secure this annulment. But the Pope, caught between the English king and the Holy Roman Emperor, delayed and prevaricated. Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. During this long, agonizing wait, Henry's passion for Anne did not wane. If anything, it intensified. Their relationship, forged in secret, was now tested by the pressures of international politics. Anne stood by his side, a constant source of support and encouragement. She wasn't just a passive object of his affection. She was an active participant in the political maneuvering, a shrewd and intelligent player in her own right. The quiet arrival of Anne Boleyn had now set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. The king's desire for this one woman was about to lead him down a path of no return. It would force him to break with the Catholic Church, declare himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and change the course of English history forever. The gentle, delicate beginnings of their love story were about to give way to one of the most dramatic and turbulent periods the country had ever known. And at the center of it all was Anne, the woman who had arrived so quietly, but whose impact would be anything but. When we think about Henry VIII and his break from the Catholic Church, our minds often jump to dramatic, explosive scenes. A king slamming his fist on a table, shouting defiance at the Pope. A sudden, violent severing of centuries-old ties. But like most major historical shifts, the reality was far more subtle and, honestly, far more human. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing burn. This seismic change didn't happen overnight. It took years of tense, whispered debates in the corridors of power, years of carefully worded letters carried by exhausted messengers, sailing back and forth between the shores of England and the hallowed halls of Rome. Henry, desperate for a male heir and captivated by Anne Boleyn, sought an annulment from his wife, Catherine of Aragon. He argued that his marriage was invalid in the eyes of God because Catherine had first been married to his older brother, Arthur. The Pope, Clement VII, was trapped. He was politically and militarily under the thumb of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Granting Henry's wish would mean angering the most powerful man in Europe. Refusing it would mean alienating a major Catholic king. So, he stalled. He formed committees. He called for more debate. He hoped the problem would somehow just go away. Meanwhile, back in England, the wait was excruciating. The entire kingdom seemed to hold its breath. Theologians and scholars were summoned to court, their noses buried in ancient texts, searching for any precedent, any loophole in canon law that could justify the king's desires. Imagine the atmosphere at court, the air thick with uncertainty. Factions formed in the shadows, some loyal to the devout Queen Catherine, others gambling on the rising star of Anne Boleyn. Every conversation, every glance, was weighed with political significance. This wasn't just a political chess game for Henry. It was a deeply personal and spiritual crisis. We have this image of him as a tyrant, a glutton, a monster. And while he could certainly be all of those things in these years, he was also a man in torment. Servants would whisper of seeing the king's candle still lit late into the night. They'd hear him pacing the long, cold stone corridors of his palaces, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He wasn't just plotting, he was praying, he was wrestling with his own conscience, feeling the immense weight of his kingdom, his dynasty, and his very soul resting on this one decision. He would sit by the fire, his eyes tired and red-rimmed, poring over scripture, trying to find a sign, some divine justification for the path he was considering. This was a man convinced he was right, yet tormented by the monumental implications of his actions. And what of the two women at the center of this storm? They were not passive pawns. Catherine of Aragon, Queen of England for over 20 years, was a figure of immense strength and piety. She refused, absolutely, to be cast aside. To her, this wasn't about politics. It was about her immortal soul and the legitimacy of her daughter, Mary. Her marriage was a sacrament, a holy vow made before God, and no man, not even a king or a pope, could undo it. She stood her ground with a quiet, unshakable dignity that won her the love and respect of the English people. She fought for her rights, for her daughter, and for her faith, using every legal and diplomatic tool at her disposal. She was not a victim, she was a fighter, defending her corner of the world with everything she had. Then there was Anne Boleyn, often painted as a calculating seductress. The truth is, as always, more complex. She was intelligent, witty, and a passionate advocate for religious reform. During these long years of waiting, she didn't just sit idly by. She used the time to educate herself, to study the very reformist texts that were being debated across Europe. She engaged with scholars, built her own network of allies, and prepared herself for the role she believed she was destined to play. She wasn't just waiting to be queen. She was actively shaping the intellectual and religious environment of the court, preparing to become a queen who would lead England into a new era. Her ambition was matched by her intellect, and her influence on Henry's thinking during this period cannot be overstated. So, the whole of England was trapped in this strange limbo, caught between two worlds. One world was the England of tradition, of 1,000 years of Catholic faith, of pilgrimage, saints, and allegiance to the Pope in Rome. The other was a new, uncertain world, a world of national sovereignty, of a church led by the king, of a future that was both terrifying and full of possibility. The arguments weren't just happening in palaces and universities. They were happening in taverns, in market squares, on farms. What did it mean to be English? What did it mean to be a good Christian? The very foundations of society were being questioned. This period of quiet, agonizing stillness, this time of letters and prayers and late-night pacing, is where the English Reformation was truly born. It wasn't in a single decree or a single battle. It was born in the years of silence, in the anxious heart of a king, and in the steadfast resolve of two formidable women. This was the quiet struggle that would change the face of Britain and a large part of the world forever. For years, Henry VIII had been a dutiful son of the Catholic Church. He'd written defenses of the faith, earning the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope himself. But behind the scenes, a personal and political storm was brewing. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, had failed to produce a male heir, a son, to secure the Tudor dynasty. His eyes had fallen upon the captivating, intelligent, and ambitious Anne Boleyn. He was convinced his marriage to Catherine, his brother's widow, was cursed in the eyes of God. He needed an annulment. He needed a way out. He petitioned Pope Clement VII, expecting a swift, favorable response. Kings had received annulments before, after all, but Henry's timing couldn't have been worse. Rome had just been sacked by the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. And who was Charles V? None other than Catherine of Aragon's powerful nephew. The Pope was effectively a prisoner, unable and unwilling to anger the most powerful man in Europe by disgracing his aunt. For 7 long years, the king's great matter dragged on. Letters were sent, emissaries dispatched, theological arguments debated endlessly. Henry grew more and more impatient. The waiting, the silence from Rome, the constant frustration, it all wore him down. He saw his youth slipping away, the future of his kingdom hanging in the balance. The Pope offered delays, committees, and vague promises, anything but the one thing Henry truly wanted, a decision. This period of limbo was agonizing for everyone involved. Catherine of Aragon stood firm, defending her marriage and the legitimacy of her daughter, Mary, with unwavering dignity. She was a popular queen, a devout Catholic, and she refused to be cast aside. Anne Boleyn, for her part, held a precarious position at court. She refused to be the king's mistress, holding out for the ultimate prize, the crown. This was an all-or-nothing gamble, and it fueled Henry's desperation to resolve the situation. The political and religious climate of Europe was already a tinderbox. The Protestant Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther in Germany just years earlier, was spreading like wildfire. New ideas about faith, the authority of the Pope, and the relationship between church and state were challenging centuries of tradition. In England, a small but influential group of reformers saw Henry's personal dilemma as a golden opportunity. Figures like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer began to whisper in the king's ear. They presented a radical solution, a path that would not only solve his marriage problem, but also grant him unprecedented power and wealth. The idea was simple, yet revolutionary. What if the king didn't need the Pope's permission at all? What if the King of England was the ultimate authority in his own realm, not just in matters of state, but in matters of the spirit as well? This was the seed of a monumental shift. It offered Henry everything he craved, a way to marry Anne, the chance for a male heir, and control over the vast wealth and power of the church in England. The pressure mounted. Henry, backed by his reformist advisors, began to systematically dismantle the Pope's authority in his kingdom. It wasn't a sudden, violent revolution. It was a slow, calculated, legal assault. One by one, a series of laws were passed by what became known as the Reformation Parliament. Each act was like a single thread being snipped, weakening the thick rope that had bound England to Rome for nearly 1,000 years. First, English clergy were forbidden from making payments to the Pope. Then, the Pope's role in appointing English bishops was abolished. The final legal barrier was the right of the English people to appeal legal cases, especially matrimonial ones, to Rome. An act was passed to forbid this, effectively trapping Catherine of Aragon's case within England, where Henry controlled the courts. Thomas Cranmer, now Archbishop of Canterbury, finally had the authority he needed. He quickly declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void, and just days later validated Henry's secret marriage to a now pregnant Anne Boleyn. The final decisive break came in 1534. It wasn't declared with the roar of cannons or the clash of armies. It was a quiet, bureaucratic affair. With the stroke of a quill pen dipped in black ink, Henry VIII gave his royal assent to the Act of Supremacy. The words were simple, but their impact was earth-shattering. The act declared that the king was, and always had been, the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Just like that, the Pope was gone. In his place stood the King. A new chapter in English history had begun. It was a quiet revolution, but a profound one. Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in a magnificent ceremony, the hopes of a dynasty resting on the child she carried. The world watched, holding its breath. Many in England were horrified, clinging to the old faith. Others were thrilled, seeing a new dawn of religious freedom and national independence. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. The break with Rome wasn't just about who was in charge of the church, it was about power and money. Henry, guided by the ever-efficient Thomas Cromwell, soon turned his attention to the monasteries. For centuries, these institutions had been centers of learning, charity, and wealth. Now, Henry saw them as relics of a corrupt papal system and, more importantly, a source of immense treasure. The dissolution of the monasteries began. Monks and nuns were turned out of their homes. Their vast lands, accumulated over centuries, were seized by the crown. Gold, silver, and precious relics were melted down and carted off to the royal treasury. This single act dramatically and permanently altered the landscape of England. It created a new class of gentry who bought the former church lands, ensuring their loyalty to the new order. The great abbey churches, once the glory of the English countryside, fell into ruin, their stones carried away to build manor houses. The social safety net provided by the monasteries caring for the poor and sick vanished, leading to widespread social unrest. The break with Rome unleashed forces that not even Henry could fully control. While he intended to create a sort of Catholicism without the Pope, others pushed for more radical Protestant reforms. The Bible was translated into English and placed in every parish church, allowing people to read the scriptures for themselves for the first time. Religious imagery was destroyed, saints' shrines were dismantled, and traditional practices were questioned. England was now on a religious roller coaster, swinging between Catholic and Protestant doctrine, depending on the king's whims and who held his favor. It was a time of fear and uncertainty. To oppose the king's supremacy was treason, an offense punishable by a brutal death. Great men like Sir Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor and a friend of the king, were executed for refusing to betray their conscience and their Catholic faith. Henry had his annulment, he had his new queen, and he had a son briefly. Anne Boleyn gave birth not to the hoped-for prince, but to a daughter, Elizabeth. When she later failed to produce a male heir, Henry's affections cooled. The very same ambition and ruthlessness that had brought him to this point would soon be turned against Anne herself. The break with Rome was born from a king's desire for a son, but it grew into something far larger. It set England on a unique historical path, shaping its politics and its relationship with the rest of Europe for centuries to come. The quiet scratch of a pen in 1534 echoed through history, a sound that was, in its own way, louder than any battle cry. Anne Boleyn's coronation in the summer of 1533 was a spectacle of unparalleled grandeur. London erupted in a riot of color and sound. Banners snapped in the wind, music blared from every corner, and the crowds roared their approval as she processed through the streets, crowned Queen of England. But even amidst the joyous celebrations, a subtle, unspoken tension hung in the air. The cheers were loud, but the silence of those who disapproved was louder still. This was a queen unlike any England had ever known. Anne was a force of nature, a queen of fire and wind. she was not content to be a silent, decorative figurehead. She was fiercely intelligent, with a sharp wit and an even sharper tongue. She spoke her mind freely, challenged long-held traditions, and demanded the respect she believed was her due as queen. She wasn't just Henry's wife, she was his partner, his intellectual equal, and she made sure everyone at court knew it. Henry, for his part, was utterly captivated by this fire. He had moved heaven and earth to have her, and he admired her spirit, her passion, her refusal to be tamed. But fire is a dangerous element. It can provide warmth and light, but it can also rage out of control and burn everything in its path. In September of that same year, 1533, the hopes of the new royal couple were partially realized. Anne gave birth not to the longed-for son and heir, but to a daughter. They named her Elizabeth, a healthy, red-haired baby who, unbeknownst to anyone at the time, would one day become one of England's most legendary and successful rulers. But in that moment, she was a disappointment. Henry was gracious, but the kingdom needed a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. The pressure on Anne was immense. The years that followed were a cruel cycle of hope and heartbreak. Anne suffered at least 2, possibly more, devastating miscarriages. Each loss was a personal tragedy and a political disaster. The whispers in the corridors of power grew louder. Henry's advisors, many of whom had always resented Anne's influence, saw their opportunity. Enemies, who had been plotting in the shadows, began to move more boldly. They dripped poison into the king's ear, questioning Anne's fidelity, her character, her very worthiness to be queen. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Henry's famous affection began to curdle. The all-consuming passion that had driven him to defy the Pope and break with the Church of Rome cooled into frustration. Frustration soured into doubt and uncertainty. He began to look at Anne, not with adoration, but with suspicion. Had he made a terrible mistake? Was God punishing him for his marriage to Anne by denying him a son? The palace, once alive with the sounds of music, laughter, and celebration, grew heavy and oppressive. A tense silence descended, thick with unspoken accusations and fear. Every glance held a hidden meaning. Every word was weighed. The court that Anne had once ruled with her charisma was now a place of danger. Then, in January 1536, Catherine of Aragon died. For some, this was a relief. But for Anne, it was the final, fatal blow. With Catherine gone, Henry was truly a widower in the eyes of Catholic Europe. He was free to remarry without the taint of bigamy. A few weeks later, Anne miscarried again, this time a baby boy. This was the end. Henry was convinced the marriage was cursed. His infatuation had turned to cold fury. He needed a new wife, one who could give him a son, and for that to happen, Anne Boleyn had to be removed. In May 1536, the axe fell. The Queen was arrested, taken from her chambers at Greenwich, and rowed down the Thames to the Tower of London. The charges were shocking, almost unbelievable. Adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, incest, and treason against the king. Historians to this day debate the truth of these accusations. Was she a victim of a vicious court conspiracy, a pawn in a political game orchestrated by her enemies, like Thomas Cromwell? Or was there some kernel of truth to the claims, exaggerated to serve the king's purpose? The evidence presented at her trial was flimsy, based on hearsay and coerced confessions. But the outcome was never in doubt. It was predetermined. She was found guilty on all counts. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn, walked to a scaffold erected on Tower Green. She was calm, dignified. As a final, small mercy, Henry had granted her request for a more humane execution. Instead of the brutal axe, he had summoned an expert swordsman from France. With a single, swift stroke, it was over. The Queen of Fire and Wind was gone. Henry did not attend the execution. He was miles away, reportedly spending the day in quiet reflection, walking through his gardens. The very next day, he was formally betrothed to his next wife, Jane Seymour. As the news of Anne's death spread, the palace seemed to sigh along, mournful. Quiet sighs, another bloody chapter of Henry's reign came to a close, and the stage was set for the next queen. After the whirlwind romances and the dramatic fall of Anne Boleyn, a new queen entered Henry VIII's life, bringing with her not a storm, but a profound and gentle calm. This was Jane Seymour. Where others were loud, she was quiet. Where others challenged, she offered comfort. Jane was the stillness Henry hadn't realized he craved. She was a soothing balm on the raw nerves of a king who had been through years of turmoil, both personal and political. Jane Seymour was a stark contrast to her predecessor, Anne Boleyn. She was fair-haired, with a pale complexion and a gentle demeanor. She came from a respectable, but not particularly powerful, noble family. She had served as a lady-in-waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, so she had witnessed firsthand the pressures and dangers of being queen. Perhaps this is why she approached her role with such caution and grace. She wasn't ambitious in the way Anne was. Her ambition was simpler, more traditional, to be a good wife, a good queen, and to provide the king with a male heir. Their courtship was quiet and discreet, conducted mostly out of the public eye while Anne's star was falling. Henry was drawn to Jane's demure nature. In her presence, he felt a sense of peace. The court, which had been a hotbed of intrigue and factional fighting, began to settle. The music in the halls seemed to soften. The constant tension that had defined the Boleyn years started to fade. Jane represented a return to a more traditional form of queenship. She was pious, gentle, and above all, obedient. Her personal motto was bound to obey and serve, a clear signal that she would not challenge the king's authority as Anne had. Henry and Jane were betrothed on May 20th, 1536, just one day after Anne Boleyn's execution. They married 10 days later. It was a swift transition, but for Henry, it was a necessary one. He was desperate for stability and, most importantly, for a son. His marriage to Jane seemed blessed from the start. She worked to reconcile Henry with his eldest daughter Mary, who had been disinherited and declared illegitimate during the break with Rome. Jane, a devout Catholic herself, sympathized with Mary's plight and gently persuaded Henry to welcome her back to court, though she couldn't restore her to the line of succession just yet. This act of kindness showed the court the kind of Queen Jane would be a peacemaker. Life with Jane was serene. The lavish, often chaotic festivities of Anne's reign were replaced by more subdued, elegant affairs. Jane was not a fashion trendsetter or a sparkling intellectual debater. She was a homebody, focused on domestic life and her husband's well-being. And for Henry, who was now in his mid-40s and suffering from a jousting wound that would plague him for the rest of his life, this was exactly what he needed. He found in Jane not a passionate lover who challenged his every move, but a comforting companion, a nurse, and a friend. He doted on her, calling her his one true wife. Then, in early 1537, came the news the whole kingdom had been praying for. Queen Jane was pregnant. The anticipation was immense. Everything hinged on this pregnancy. Would it be another daughter? Or would Henry finally get his legitimate male heir? The entire court held its breath. As the months went on, Jane was treated with the utmost care. Henry was constantly by her side, catering to her every whim. The future of the Tudor dynasty rested within her. On October 12, 1537, after a long and difficult labor that lasted 2 days and 3 nights, Jane gave birth to a healthy baby boy at Hampton Court Palace. He was named Edward Les. His dream, the obsession that had driven him to break with the Catholic Church, divorce his first wife, and execute his second, was finally fulfilled. England had a male heir. The kingdom erupted in celebration. Bells rang out across London. Bonfires were lit, and Te Deums were sung in churches throughout the land. Prince Edward's christening was a magnificent affair, a symbol of all of Henry's hopes secured. But this moment of supreme triumph was tragically shrilly. Just a few days after the christening, Jane fell gravely ill. She had developed puerperal fever, a common and often fatal infection after childbirth in the 16th century. The palace, once filled with sounds of celebration, fell silent, shrouded in fear. The best physicians in the kingdom were summoned, but they were powerless against the raging infection. Henry, frantic with worry, barely left her bedside. He had just found his perfect queen, the mother of his son, and now he was faced with the terrifying prospect of losing her. For 12 days, the court waited and prayed, but Jane's health only faded. On October 24th, 1537, just 2 weeks after giving birth to the future king, Queen Jane Seymour died. Henry was utterly devastated. His joy had turned to ashes. He had found his moment of peace, only to have it snatched away. His grief was profound and genuine. He ordered the court into mourning and retired from public life, refusing to see almost anyone. He wore black for months, a constant, visible symbol of his sorrow. The boisterous, larger-than-life king retreated into himself. He would often be seen standing alone on the palace balconies, staring out at the horizon, lost in thought. He was mourning the queen who had brought him such tranquility, the woman who had given him his precious son. Jane Seymour's legacy was cemented by this tragedy. In Henry's eyes, she remained the perfect wife, untainted by the conflict and drama of his other marriages. She had done her duty and died for it. Her brief reign was remembered as a golden moment of peace and stability. Years later, when Henry VIII made his own will, he gave a final, touching instruction. He asked to be buried next to Jane Seymour in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Of all his 6 wives, she was the one he chose to lie beside for eternity. She was the mother of his heir, the queen who never challenged him, the woman who, for a brief time, gave his turbulent heart a moment of peace. After Jane Seymour's death, a somber quiet fell over the English court. Henry VIII was a king in mourning, a man who had finally found what he believed to be true love, only to have it snatched away by the cruel hand of fate. He had his long-awaited male heir, Prince Edward, but the cost had been immense. For 2 long years, Henry remained a widower, consumed by grief and the heavy responsibilities of his crown. But in the ruthless chess game of 16th century European politics, a king, especially the King of England, could not remain single for long. The great powers of Europe, France, and the Holy Roman Empire were circling. Their long-standing rivalry momentarily paused. England, isolated by its break from the Catholic Church, was vulnerable. An alliance was not just desirable, it was essential for survival. And in that era, the most powerful seal on any alliance was a royal marriage. The search for a new queen began, managed by Henry's chief minister, the shrewd and ambitious Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell, a staunch advocate for the Protestant Reformation, saw a golden opportunity. He looked towards the Protestant princes of Germany, who were forming a league to stand against the Catholic Emperor Charles V. An alliance here would not only secure England's borders, but also strengthen the Protestant cause throughout Europe. His gaze settled on the Duchy of Cleves, a small but strategically important state. The Duke of Cleves had two unmarried sisters, Anne and Amelia. A match with one of them could be the perfect political move. But Henry was a man who had married for love, for passion, and even for desperate obsession. He was not a king who would agree to a marriage sight unseen. He needed to know what his future bride looked like. Enter Hans Holbein, the younger, the court's master painter. A man whose artistic genius was matched only by his incredible ability to capture the true essence of his subjects. Henry dispatched Holbein to the continent with a critical mission to paint the Cleves sisters so he could make his choice. Holbein's portraits were renowned for their realism, their almost photographic quality. When the portrait of Anne of Cleves arrived back in England, the court was captivated. The painting depicted a young woman of gentle bearing and modest charm. Her face was framed by an elaborate German headdress, her expression serene and dignified. Henry was pleased. Based on Holbein's masterful work, he saw a suitable, even attractive, partner. He agreed to the match. The diplomatic gears turned. The marriage treaty was signed, and Anne of Cleves prepared for her long journey to a new country and a new life as Queen of England. Anne's journey was arduous, a long trek across a wintry Europe. She finally landed in England at the very end of 1539, arriving at Rochester, where she was to rest before her official state entry into London and her formal meeting with the king. But Henry, ever the impatient romantic, couldn't wait. He was eager to meet the woman from the portrait, the one who would secure his kingdom and perhaps, just perhaps, heal his grieving heart. Disguising himself and a few of his gentlemen, he rode to Rochester, planning to surprise his bride in a grand, chivalrous gesture, bursting into her chambers with gifts like a hero from a romance tale. The reality, however, was a disaster. When Henry burst in, Anne, who didn't speak English and had been raised in a far more formal and sheltered court, was utterly bewildered. She didn't recognize this large, middle-aged man. She was confused, startled, and her reaction was not one of delighted surprise, but of polite, reserved confusion. For Henry, this moment was a crushing disappointment. The woman he saw before him was, in his eyes, nothing like the delicate beauty in Holbein's portrait. He found her plain, tall, and lacking the courtly graces and sophisticated charms he was accustomed to in English and French court ladies. He felt deceived, tricked. Famously, he lamented to his ministers, "I like her not, I like her not." He felt trapped. The political machinery was already in motion. To reject Anne now would be a catastrophic diplomatic insult. It would not only shatter the carefully constructed German alliance, but could potentially push Cleves into the arms of his enemies, leaving England more isolated than ever. The wedding had to proceed. Despite his profound personal misgivings and his growing fury at Thomas Cromwell for arranging the match, Henry knew he had to go through with it. On January 6, 1540, Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves were married in a subdued ceremony. There was none of the joy or public celebration that had marked his previous weddings. From the very beginning, the marriage was a failure. Henry made his displeasure clear to everyone around him. He found no way to connect with Anne, either physically or emotionally. The cultural gap was immense. Anne was quiet, modest, and her skills lay in domestic arts like needlework, not in the music, dancing, and witty conversation that Henry so enjoyed. The marriage was never consummated. Henry, in private, complained to his physicians and counselors that he was simply unable to perform his husbandly duties with her. The political alliance that the marriage was meant to secure was also quickly becoming obsolete. The brief truce between France and the Holy Roman Empire was already fracturing, and the threat of a combined Catholic invasion of England faded. The very reason for the marriage had evaporated. The entire arrangement had become a political and personal embarrassment for the king. It was clear to everyone that the marriage was doomed. The king wanted out, and he needed a way to do it quickly and cleanly without creating an international incident. The axe began to fall, and its first target was the man Henry blamed for the whole fiasco, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell's enemies at court, led by the conservative Duke of Norfolk, seized the opportunity. They poisoned the king's ear, blaming Cromwell not only for the disastrous marriage, but also accusing him of heresy and treason. Cromwell's fall was as swift as his rise had been. He was arrested, condemned without a trial, and executed. With Cromwell gone, the path was clear to dissolve the marriage. A pretext was found: Anne's supposed pre-contract to another European noble, Francis of Lorraine. It was a flimsy legal argument, but in Henry's kingdom, the king's will was law. Now, this is the point in the story where, for one of Henry's wives, things usually take a very dark turn. But Anne of Cleves was different. She was pragmatic, intelligent, and she understood the dangerous game she was in. When she was asked to consent to an annulment, she didn't fight. She didn't protest or insist on her rights as queen. Instead, she agreed. With remarkable grace and political savvy, she accepted the king's decision. She testified that the marriage had never been consummated and agreed to the annulment. This clever move likely saved her life. Henry, who had been dreading a difficult, stubborn fight, was enormously relieved and surprisingly grateful. His anger and disappointment towards Anne softened into a genuine and lasting affection. In return for her cooperation, Henry was incredibly generous. He gave her the title King's Beloved Sister, a position of high honor within the court. He granted her a handsome income, several grand residences, including Hever Castle, the former home of Anne Boleyn. She was given a place of precedence over all other women in England, except for the king's own wife and daughters. In an instant, Anne of Cleves went from being a discarded foreign bride to one of the wealthiest and most independent women in the entire kingdom. She was free from the terrifying pressures of being Henry's queen, free from the need to produce an heir, and free to live her life in comfort and security. She had, in essence, won the Tudor lottery. Anne chose to remain in England rather than return to Cleves in disgrace, and she thrived. She learned to speak English fluently, embraced English customs, and became a familiar and welcome figure at court. She and Henry developed a surprisingly warm and genuine friendship. They exchanged New Year's gifts, and she was often invited to banquets and celebrations. He would visit her, and they would dine together, to people bound by a strange history, finding a comfortable peace with one another. When Henry married his next wife, Catherine Howard, Anne was there, a respected guest. She seemed to hold no grudge. She had played her part, survived, and was now enjoying a life of peaceful independence that was denied to so many of her contemporaries. She outlived not only Henry, but all of his other wives, passing away peacefully in her 50s during the reign of Henry's daughter, Queen Mary I, Anne of Cleves. The Flanders mare, as she was cruelly nicknamed, proved to be one of the smartest and luckiest women to ever enter Henry's orbit. Through quiet dignity and shrewd common sense, she navigated the treacherous waters of the Tudor court and found a safe harbor, securing a peaceful and prosperous life in a world where so many others met a tragic end. After the political and personal disappointments of his marriage to Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII found himself completely captivated by a young, vivacious teenager from the powerful Howard family. She was barely out of her girlhood, full of life and laughter, a stark contrast to the aging, increasingly infirm king. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed Henry had found his perfect match. Catherine was his rose, without a thorn, the jewel of his world. She brought a youthful energy back to the court, and for the first time in years, the king seemed genuinely happy. He showered her with gifts, jewels, and lands. He doted on her, parading her around as a symbol of his own renewed vitality. It was a whirlwind romance, a May-December marriage that saw Catherine crowned Queen of England in 1540. Henry, nearly 30 years her senior, was utterly besotted. He looked at her and saw a future, a fresh start. He was a man who had been through so much political turmoil, religious upheaval, and personal heartbreak. In Catherine, he thought he had finally found his reward, a joyful companion for his later years. But Henry was no longer the dashing prince of his youth. He was now a man in his late 40s, plagued by chronic health issues. A jousting accident from years earlier had left him with a festering, painful ulcer on his leg. This constant agony, combined with his increasing weight, made him irritable and prone to fits of rage. His once athletic frame was gone, replaced by the heavy, lumbering figure we often see in his later portraits. He was a man burdened by the weight of his crown, his failing body, and the ghosts of his past. The court was a dangerous place, a web of ambition and intrigue, and Henry's paranoia grew with every passing day. He relied on his advisors, but trusted no one completely. He was the sun around which the entire court revolved, but it was a sun that could scorch as easily as it could warm. Into this tense and dangerous world stepped Catherine. She was young, perhaps naive, and certainly unprepared for the scrutiny that came with being queen. She had a past, one that was not uncommon for a young woman of her station, but one that would prove deadly in her new position. Before she ever met the king, she had been involved in flirtations and relationships. One was with her music teacher, Henry Mannix. Another, more serious involvement, was with a gentleman in her grandmother's household named Francis Derham. These were the dalliances of a young girl, but in the rigid and unforgiving world of the Tudor court, they were secrets that could be weaponized. Catherine, it seems, brought some of these old connections with her to court. She appointed Francis Derham as one of her secretaries, a reckless move that placed her past dangerously close to her present. It wasn't just her past that was a problem. As queen, Catherine's vivacious nature didn't simply disappear. She was surrounded by people her own age, and she craved the excitement and romance that were missing from her marriage to the ailing king. Soon, her attention turned to a handsome and charismatic courtier, a favorite of the king's named Thomas Culpeper. They began to meet in secret, aided by Catherine's lady-in-waiting, the infamous Lady Rochford. who had also been a key witness against Anne Boleyn. Whether their relationship was a full-blown affair or simply a series of foolish, romantic encounters is debated by historians. But what is certain is that it was an incredible risk. They exchanged letters and arranged clandestine meetings in a court where every wall had ears and every glance was analyzed. They were playing with fire. The whispers started slowly, a suspicious conversation here, a knowing look there. The court was a hotbed of gossip and rivalry. Those who had been displaced by the Howard family's rise to power were watching, waiting for an opportunity. The religious reformers at court, who despised the Catholic-leaning Howards, saw their chance. A man named John Lascelles, whose sister had served with Catherine in their grandmother's house, came forward. He told Archbishop Thomas Cranmer everything he knew about Catherine's past indiscretions with Manox and Derham. Cranmer, a loyal servant of the king, but also a key figure in the English Reformation, knew he had a duty to act. This was political dynamite. He understood the king's temper and his deep pride. He also knew that if these accusations were true, the queen's life was in grave danger. Cranmer chose his moment carefully. During Mass, he slipped a letter to the king detailing the allegations. At first, Henry refused to believe it. He was enraged, not at Catherine, but at those who would dare to slander his perfect rose without a thorn. He ordered an investigation, fully expecting it to prove her innocence and punish her accusers. He could unfathom that the girl who had brought him so much joy could have deceived him so completely. But the investigation, quiet and careful at first, quickly uncovered a damning trail of evidence. Servants were questioned. Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper were arrested and taken to the Tower of London. Under torture, or the threat of it, they confessed. Derham spoke of his premarital relationship with Catherine, and evidence of the secret meetings with Culpeper came to light. The king's world shattered. His joy turned to fury, his love to a deep, agonizing sense of betrayal. The chronicles of the time describe him weeping, lamenting his terrible fortune in marriage. He had been made a fool, his honor stained by a girl he had lifted from obscurity to the highest position in the land. Catherine was confronted with the evidence. At first, she denied everything, but as the testimonies mounted against her, she collapsed. She was placed under house arrest at Sion Abbey, stripped of her titles and her household. There, she reportedly fell into a state of near madness, frantic with terror. She finally wrote a full confession, admitting to her past with Derham, but desperately denying any wrongdoing with Culpeper after her marriage. She pleaded for mercy, signing her confession, "Your Majesty's most humble servant and subject, Catherine." But there would be no mercy. A bill of attainder was passed through Parliament, a legal device that condemned her to death without a formal trial. In the cold winter of 1542, Catherine Howard, probably no older than 19, was taken by barge to the Tower of London. A few days later, on the morning of February 13th, she was led out to the same scaffold on Tower Green where her cousin, Anne Boleyn, had met her end just 6 years earlier. Accounts say she was dignified but terrified. She spoke briefly, admitting her guilt and asking for prayers for her soul. Then, with a single strike of the executioner's axe, the short, tragic life of Henry's fifth queen came to an end. The execution of Catherine Howard marked a turning point for Henry. The laughter she had brought to his life was replaced by a profound and lasting darkness. The betrayal cut him deeper than any physical wound. He became more suspicious, more tyrannical. His health continued to decline, and his leg became a constant source of agony. He moved through the palace slowly now, a hulking, sorrowful figure, leaning on his servants for support. The vibrant court of his youth was a distant memory, replaced by a colder, more somber world. He was scarred by loss, betrayal, and the weight of his own decisions. The tragic fall of his youthful queen was a final, brutal reminder of the fleeting nature of happiness and the terrible price of power. We're exploring the life of Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth and final wife. After the dramatic and tragic end of Catherine Howard, the court was in a state of shock. Henry VIII, now in his 50s, was a shadow of his former self. He was overweight, plagued by painful leg ulcers, and prone to volatile fits of temper. He was no longer the dashing, athletic monarch of his youth. He was an aging, ailing king in desperate need of a companion, a nurse, and a source of stability. And that's exactly what he found in Catherine Parr. Catherine wasn't a naive young girl like Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard. She was a mature widow, twice married before she caught the king's eye. Born in 1512, she came from a respectable northern family and had received a fine education. By the time she came to court in the early 1540s, she was known for her piety, her sharp mind, and her dignified presence. Interestingly, she was actually in love with another man, Thomas Seymour, the brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour. They had planned to marry, but when the king proposed, Catherine knew she had no choice. It was her duty to her king and her country. So, in July of 1543, she became Queen of England. Many at court probably thought she was walking into a death trap. After all, Henry's track record with wives was not exactly encouraging, but Catherine was different. She approached her role not with ambition for power or romantic fantasy, but with a profound sense of duty and a remarkable level of emotional intelligence. She understood the broken man Henry had become. She didn't challenge him or try to change him. Instead, she offered him something he hadn't had in a very long time: genuine companionship. Catherine became his confidant and his nurse. She would personally dress his painful leg sores, a task many would find repulsive. She read to him from the Holy Scriptures, engaging him in deep theological discussions. This was a shared passion. Catherine was a devout Protestant reformer, and her intellectual grasp of religion was impressive. She even wrote and published her own books of prayers and lamentations, a truly astonishing feat for a woman of her time, let alone a queen consort. Her book, Prayers or Meditations, was the first work ever published by an English queen under her own name. Her influence wasn't just limited to the king's private chambers. Catherine Parr understood the importance of family. The royal family was fractured. Henry's relationships with his two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were strained, to say the least. Both had been declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. Catherine saw the pain this caused and worked tirelessly to mend these broken bonds. She created a warm and stable home environment, treating Mary and Elizabeth with the affection and respect of a loving stepmother. She encouraged the king to spend more time with his children, including his young son, Prince Edward. She oversaw their education, ensuring they had the best tutors and a curriculum that was both classical and forward-thinking, especially for Elizabeth. It was thanks to Catherine's gentle but persistent influence that Henry finally passed the third act of succession in 1544. This monumental act restored both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession right after their brother Edward. This single act changed the course of English history. Without Catherine Parr, Queen Mary I and the great Queen Elizabeth I might never have reigned. But being a queen with strong religious convictions in Henry's court was a dangerous game. Catherine's Protestant sympathies made her powerful enemies, particularly conservative figures like Bishop Stephen Gardiner. They saw her influence over the king as a threat. They watched, waited, and plotted, hoping to catch her in a moment of heresy, and they almost succeeded. In 1546, her enemies convinced the king that Catherine had gone too far in their religious debates, that she was lecturing him rather than comforting him. The notoriously proud Henry was furious. An arrest warrant was drawn up for the queen. It was a terrifying moment. Catherine could have easily ended up like Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard, but this is where her wisdom truly shone. When she learned of the plot against her, she didn't panic. She went to Henry, not to argue, but to submit. She played the part of the humble, devoted wife perfectly. She told him that she only debated with him to distract him from his pain and to learn from his great wisdom. She flattered his ego, soothed his pride, and completely disarmed him. When the guards arrived the next day to arrest her, Henry flew into a rage, not at Catherine, but at them, calling them knaves and fools. Catherine had outmaneuvered her enemies and secured her survival with pure intelligence and emotional acuity. On January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII died. Catherine Parr had done what many thought was impossible. She had survived him. This, in itself, was a monumental achievement for a Tudor queen. As Queen Dowager, she was now free to follow her heart. Shortly after Henry's death, she married the man she had always loved, Thomas Seymour. For a brief time, it seemed she would finally have the happy, private life she deserved. She also became the guardian of the young Princess Elizabeth, continuing to mentor the future queen. Tragically, her happiness was short-lived. In 1548, Catherine gave birth to her only child, a daughter named Mary. But complications from childbirth set in, and just a week later, Catherine Parr, the Queen of Wisdom, the survivor, the peacemaker, died. She was only about 36 years old. Her legacy is one of quiet, profound impact. She didn't seek power or glory, but she wielded immense influence through her intelligence, kindness, and patience. She brought a measure of peace to a troubled king. She reunited a broken family, and she helped shape the mind of one of England's greatest monarchs. Catherine Parr was more than just the wife who survived. She was the steady hand that guided the Tudor dynasty through its final turbulent years. Her story is a powerful reminder that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet wisdom that changes the world.